Okay, so this is our last video on the Protestant Reformation. And in this video, we're going to look at the Catholic response to the Reformation. So we're going to look at the Catholic response to the Reformation. You might see this described as the Catholic Reformation. You might also see this described as the Counter-Reformation. It depends on who you're asking. The Catholics would call this the Catholic Reformation to make it seem like they're the ones doing this. Protestants would often call this the Counter-Reformation because it is in response to what the Protestants are doing. So depending on who you're asking, this might have this name or that name. It's talking about the same thing. It's all about the Catholic response to the Reformation. Okay, so despite all of the ill will and conflict that the Reformation started and will continue to create, like inside the church, deep down, the Pope understood that Luther had a point. Like the idea that the church was corrupt, the idea that the church was actively preventing people from learning things, the hierarchical nature of the church, the corrupt nature of the church, all of that the Pope understood. He'd never say so publicly, but the idea that Luther was right. The church understood that Luther was kind of right. And the fact that so many people left the church to go with Luther was an indication of that. That so many people had become fed up with the corruption and the luxury of the church that they went with the only alternative there was, and that was Luther. So in the 1530s, the church understood, or the church knew, the Reformation wasn't going anywhere. The Reformation was here to stay. It wasn't going to be killed or squashed like other reform movements had been. So they knew that the Reformation was here to stay. So the Pope calls a church council, which coincidentally is the only institution within the Catholic Church that has more authority than the Pope himself. And this church council becomes known as the Council of Trent because it was held in the Italian city of Trent. It starts in 1545 and it moves on, off and on until 1563. Now, at first, the Council of Trent tried to get the Protestants to come back. But they realized pretty quickly, actually, that they wouldn't be coming back. And so then started to focus on how to reform the Catholic Church. So this was seen as a non-starter. So then they tried to define or redefine what it meant to be Catholic. What does it mean to be Catholic? So think about it like this: those that remained with the Catholic Church wanted to be Catholic. They didn't want to leave the church. They didn't want to leave what they had believed in. And so, really, what the Council of Trent does, the Council of Trent kind of doubles down on Catholicism. It's a reassertion of Catholic dogma. So, for instance, they would say that the Bible is only in Latin. The real Bible is only in Latin. You can only get the sacraments from a priest. The Pope is in charge. All the stuff that we normally think of as being Catholic, the Council of Trent is like, yes, this is what it means to be Catholic. Those of you that stuck with us, we're not changing what we're doing. The Catholic Church is still the Catholic Church. We're not changing any of those core ideas. But there are a few things that we will admit that Luther had a point about. So they're going to stop. So there are a few changes. We're going to stop selling indulgences. You can still get an indulgence. It's just now seen as a reward that you earn rather than something you can buy. So you can still get an indulgence today for doing something to help out the church, but you can't buy an indulgence anymore. They're going to kind of make it so that clergy members have to live in their parishes. Basically, you could be given a job as a priest and then never visit the place you lived in because this was a status symbol. So being a priest gave you certain social perks, although you may never actually do any of the jobs of a priest. So now they're saying that clergy members have to live in their district, in their parish. And they're actually going to make sure that their clergy are qualified, not just the friend of somebody in charge. So they're going to make sure that the clergy members know how to read and know how to write and understand what being Catholic means. But maybe the biggest change is a new focus on education. Get a new focus on education. So the church could no longer rely on ignorance anymore. The printing press, and especially what Luther had been telling everybody about how the church functioned, made it so that the church couldn't rely on people being ignorant of those facts. What the church now needs to do, it now needs to convince people that the Catholic Church is right and has everyone's best interest at heart. It's not enough for them to talk about what it means. They now have to convince people that the Catholic Church is right. They can't just say that they're right and have people believe them. That has been thrown out the window. Luther opened the door, and now everyone can see what the church is doing. Now the church has to convince people that they're right. And to do that, they have to educate people. And the best example of these changes, so the changes that we're seeing here, both the doubling down on Catholicism and these new changes, especially this focus on anti-corruption, is the Jesuits. So the best example of all of this stuff are the Jesuits. The Jesuits are members of the Society of Jesus. They were founded in 1540 by a Spanish soldier who became a priest. His name was Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola. The Jesuits, so the new Society of Jesus, reflects his military background. So it's very hierarchical. They follow strict orders. They're highly disciplined, but they're also extremely well trained and educated. So basically, what the Jesuits would do is these guys were like the Catholic special forces. If the Pope needed a spiritual emergency taken care of, he would send in the Jesuits. Much like the Green Berets or Navy SEALs, when you needed a job done, you would call in the Jesuits because they would absolutely get your spiritual mission done for you. They accepted orders to go anywhere in the world, and in fact, a lot of the early Catholic priests who came over with Columbus and other early European explorers were Jesuits because it was their mission to spread Catholicism no matter where. And so they got on these boats and sailed across the ocean to places that no one had ever seen before. They were really good debaters. And they were very good. They were really skilled at convincing Protestants to come back. They were really good at convincing Protestants to come back, usually because they were really stubborn and refused to concede. So usually they just wore the Protestants out and convinced them to come back that way. These guys also founded a lot of Catholic schools. I think most Catholic high schools are founded by Jesuits or organizations that are related to the Jesuits. In fact, there's usually, in whatever area you're in, there's usually somewhere nearby a Jesuit high school. That's just called Jesuit high school. But maybe the most important thing to remember about the Jesuits is that they would do anything to advance the mission of the church. So the kind of the guidebook of the Jesuits, written by Ignatius, was called his Spiritual Exercises. And in it, he wrote, "What seems to me white, I will believe black if the hierarchical church deems it so." So Jesuits were willing to believe whatever the church told them because the church told them so. So they are, I wouldn't say that they're mindless, because they absolutely know what they're doing. They just have a very singular mission in front of them. And that mission is to advance the church. Now, even though they are now more open to education, even though the church is open to education now, they still want a monopoly on information. And you might even go as far as to say a monopoly on official Christianity. So, for instance, even though they're open to education and they want people to be able to read and maybe even think for themselves a little bit, the church, specifically the Jesuits were in charge of the prohibited book list, or the prohibited book index, the index of prohibited books, which was a list of books that the church deemed to be too heretical for regular people to read. So initially, you've got a lot of the Protestant texts in there. So like John Calvin's book was in there. Later on, a lot of Enlightenment thinkers' books are in there. I think they stopped putting books onto the list in the 20th century. I think the last book that was put on it was in the 1960s. But it still exists. There are still books that officially Catholics are not supposed to read. but now it's not really followed. But at the time, the Jesuits were really the only people that were uh, devout and strong enough to read these books and know what they said and be able to debate people on them. So the Jesuits had to read these books and understand what they say and then think about how they could debate people who read those books. So they had to understand what's in them and then develop counter arguments to those ideas. Another thing that the church did was they created inquisitors who would root out heresy and corruption within the church. And that's what the job of an inquisitor was, to find corrupt or heretical priests and fix them, like get them out of circulation, fix them, and then put them back into circulation once they were fixed. Now, of course, the most famous of these inquisitions was the Spanish Inquisition, which started off this way, but became a way for the Spanish government to punish Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity. They believed that if you were a Jew or a Muslim, you couldn't be properly Christian. They thought that they were insufficiently Christian. So we'll stop there. We'll pick this story back up when we start talking about European exploration, which I believe will be our next big topic. So we'll pick up this story about Spain in our next set of videos, which will be on European exploration. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.